Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in for tonight's program, co-presented by Shapeshifters Cinema and Canyon Cinema, titled Kerry Laitala and Jonathan Walley on Expanded Cinema and Cinema Expanded. That's a lot of cinemas. Cinema Expanded being the title of Jonathan's recent book, published in July of 2020 by Oxford University Press, which is the occasion for tonight's conversation. My name is Brett Cashmere, and I'm the executive director of Canyon Cinema, which was founded 60 years ago in Bruce Bailey's backyard in the East Bay village of Canyon, California, which has subsequently settled in San Francisco, where we currently distribute over 3,000 artist-made films and digital media artworks. We're thrilled to be partnering tonight with another born in the East Bay experimental media mainstay, Oakland's own Shapeshifters Cinema, to bring you this program, which will be structured in 3 parts. In part 1, Jonathan will give a brief overview of his book before discussing some of Carrie's paracinematic and projection performance works and the role of the artist's studio in expanded cinema practice. That'll be about 15 minutes. Then Carrie will take over and share documentation of her own studio and will present some of her projects. That will also be about 15 minutes. And then in part 3, Jonathan and Carrie will be united in conversation about their work and each other's work. And we will then open things up to the audience for questions. So I encourage you to add your comments and your questions in the chat. I will also be dropping Jonathan and Carrie's bios as well as relevant links in the chat. Finally, a big thank you to the Hobbs and Lucas Family Foundation and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the visual arts for their generous support of Canyon's public programs. Thanks as well to Kathleen Quillian and Gilbert Guerrero for helping put on this show and for all of their work behind the scenes. And thanks to Seth Mitter and Kathleen McGuire for their help in preparing this show as well. I hope you enjoy the program. And now here is Jonathan Walley.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Walley, and this is a brief video introduction to expanded cinema, at least as I've come to understand it in over 2 decades of research and writing. I'm going to talk first about expanded cinema somewhat broadly, then focus on the expanded work of Kerry Laitala, who will follow my presentation with her own video presentation. Expanded cinema is a spatial metaphor. It implies that cinema is getting bigger, occupying more territory. I see this expansion taking place in 3 dimensions. It's a technological expansion, beginning with the sudden proliferation of electronic imaging and communications media in the 1960s, when the term expanded cinema was first coined. Video and television, computer imaging, projected light, holography, and emerging telecommunications technologies constituted an expanded field of moving image media. Early accounts of expanded cinema, most notably Gene Youngblood's landmark book of that title, privileged these new media over celluloid and traditional cinema. It's also a categorical expansion, as the art of cinema took on new forms. These were often associated with specific technologies, but were not identical with them. Both video art like Shigeka Kubota's Duchampiana Nude Descending a Staircase, and alternative television and broadcasts like Stan Vanderbeek's Violence Sonata used video, but quite different variants of video, thus producing decidedly different meanings and experiences. Video art and televisual events, moving image installation, light art, computer animation, even kinetic sculpture and multimedia performance all fell under the heading of expanded cinema during the 1960s and 70s. And finally, this was also a literal expansion of cinema from the illusory space of the 2-dimensional screen into real 3-dimensional space in the form of projection, performance, and installation. Even multi-screen films, which were some of the earliest works to be called expanded, represent a sort of lateral expansion across the space of the screen, and in some works, an overwhelming multiplication of screens. Okay, all this expansion makes expanded cinema a pretty unwieldy category, as evidenced by the sheer number of terms for different types of expanded cinema enumerated by generations of commentators. Attempts to map cinema's expanded field have actually been more disorienting than orienting. George Mashunis's well-known expanded arts diagram of 1966 situates expanded cinema at the intersection of a slew of often undefined and perplexing artistic crosscurrents. The scholar Duncan White's more recent map of expanded cinema is a haphazard jumble of categories pitched at widely varying levels of generality. Behind these categories is a nexus of crisscrossing lines, implying that the map is also a kind of family tree, enabling the user to trace connections among individuals, events, and movements. Attempting to do this, however, often reveals dead ends, inexplicable associations, or unmade links. I've always found expanded cinema's unwieldiness at once fascinating and frustrating. Fascinating for the questions expanded cinema confronts us with. How does one define an art form, especially one like cinema, which seems to be defined by technological and aesthetic change? And if all of the arts are expanding, at what point can we distinguish one art form from another, say a film, from a weaving or a performance? What is the relationship between cinema and the other arts? And what is the relationship between an art form and a physical medium or an art historical tradition? An art form like cinema, a physical medium like film, or an art historical tradition like experimental film? And of course, what is cinema? And what isn't? These questions have also been central to experimental film's history in general, not just in expanded cinema. And these questions are all the more urgent now, I think, in light of the proliferation of digital media, the explosion of moving image work, especially in the art world, and the repeated proclamations of the deaths of both celluloid film and cinema itself. My frustrations in studying expanded cinema have mostly stemmed from the fact that commentary on the subject too often answers these questions unsatisfactorily, or simply sidesteps them altogether. For some, such questions just don't matter. The very idea of defining and distinguishing between art forms is hopelessly outmoded, it is thought, a relic of prescriptive modernist theory that fails to recognize art's historical dynamism. In the 1960s and 70s, expanded cinema was heralded as a liberation from the confines of specific technologies, forms, and exhibition spaces, from the strictures, that is, of stuffy tradition. Intermedia, a word often used interchangeably with expanded cinema, was the art world's equivalent of the day's radical countercultural politics, a politics of total liberation from restrictions and boundaries, whether technological, aesthetic, or social. Now, in the new millennium, intermedia is back with a vengeance, rebranded with the rather unfortunate academic neologism intermediality. The contemporary moving image, now digital, electronic, ephemeral, free from specific exhibition spaces and thus utterly pervasive in our culture, is for some the paradigmatic case of intermedia. Now, I just used the phrase the moving image, which has become ubiquitous in both the art and academic worlds, a blanket term just like expanded cinema has been. It is a sign of this contemporary intermedial ethos in its lack of any sort of specificity. The moving image denotes no specific medium, like film or video, no particular mode of exhibition, theatrical, installation, streaming, and no specific tradition, e.g., experimental film, art cinema, Hollywood, television. Historical and contemporary work in expanded cinema has been taken up into critical accounts of this phenomenon. So we have the inters and the posts. intermedia, interdisciplinarity, and inter-arts interstices, signs of the postmodern, the post-medium, the post-cinema age. For some, expanded cinema is the model of this condition, proof of cinema's inherent intermediality and thus undefinability. Now, I disagree, and at great length, in my recent book, Cinema Expanded, Avant-Garde Film in the Age of Intermedia. Years of research has led me to the conclusion that some contraction, if you will, of expanded cinema was necessary. Hence the inversion of my book's main title, Cinema Expanded. Previous histories and theories of the subject have privileged the expanded to the extent that the cinema can become virtually meaningless. In Expanded Cinema, for example, Gene Youngblood wrote, "When we say expanded cinema, we actually mean expanded consciousness. Expanded cinema does not mean computer films, video phosphors, atomic light, or spherical projections. Expanded cinema isn't a movie at all. Like life, it's a process of becoming." This flip-flopping of my book's title signals my emphasis on the cinema in expanded cinema. I restore cinema as we have known it, so to speak, as the ground on which expanded cinema can be defined and even recognized in the first place, against a welter of other moving image forms and histories. Cinema has always been an expanding category, but I argue that this expansion has not been so unfettered as to make the category gaseous and therefore without meaning. So I restore expanded cinema to the historical context of a relatively specific art form, cinema. Going further, I restore experimental film in particular as the most proximate cinematic tradition for expanded cinema. Experimental film is historically linked with the art world in ways that other cinematic traditions simply aren't, but it has also been marked by a specifying impulse, the specification of film as medium, cinema as art form, and experimental film as distinct cinematic mode. So for me, expanded cinema is the result of both expansion and contraction. It manifests the complementary impulses of, on the one hand, opening up definitions and maintaining delimitations, of exploring the territory that cinema shares with other art forms like performance, and clarifying distinctions between such territories in an act of specification and narrowing. And finally, expanded cinema, on the one hand, plumbs the material depths of cinema's physical media, especially celluloid film, while also, on the other hand, casting about in the furthest outer reaches of cinema's conceptual and discursive dimensions. Finally, I also distinguish among three general modes or types of expanded cinema, though these are not mutually exclusive. Each mode of expanded cinema corresponds to another non-cinematic art form: cinema as object, as in sculptural object; cinema as performance, as in this recent projector performance by Gene Youngblood; and cinema as idea or concept, as in conceptual art. Framing my account in terms of these categories allows for a thorough exploration of expanded cinema's process of negotiation between the autonomy of cinema on the one hand and cinema's multiple connections to the other arts on the other. Now I want to talk about Carrie's work in particular. Carrie was probably the first contemporary practitioner of expanded cinema I became aware of, way back in the early 2000s. Carrie's work models many of the defining traits of expanded cinema: a skepticism towards digital media and the corporate capitalist values it embodies, a semantic richness characterized by multiple layers of meaning and reference, a playfulness too, and a preoccupation with film history. Carrie has also worked in all three expanded modes: cinema as performance, as object, and as conceptual or discursive work. Carrie's work, both expanded and otherwise, plays upon a variety of historical connections, following cinema's genealogical lines into obscure corners where it intertwines with arcane practices and beliefs like alchemy and spiritualism. Each of these areas provides generative ideas for expanded cinema and interpretive frameworks employed in critical writing, including Laitala's own. Describing her 2004 projection performance Hand-Cranked Muse of Cinema, which utilized a 1921 hand-operated 35mm projector, Laitala analogizes herself to the itinerant projectionist of early cinema. According to her, the co-presence of projector, projectionist, and audience in the same space was a hallmark of a more interactive and knowing relationship among them. She thus sees early cinema as an emblem of experimental cinema's ideals of active spectatorship and resistance to the commercial film industry's restrictions. Laitala implies that the standardization and automaticization of projection paralleled the rise of commercial narrative cinema to its position of dominance over the avant-garde. Laitala writes of, quote, the projector being scurried out of sight and cinema quickly becoming manacled, enslaved by the traditional notions of narrative and theater that would determine its function in society on a mass scale, unquote. Hand-Cranked Muse of Cinema revives the more direct, live relationship of projectionist and spectator and some of the wildness of early cinema. Laitala made the film by printing magic lantern slides onto 35mm film. The slides consisted mostly of instructions for proper audience behavior in the very early years of cinema. Today's equivalent would be those reminders to turn off your phone before the movie starts. Laitala transferred these magic lantern images to 35mm motion picture film by laying the slides on the unexposed film and using a flashlight to make direct, cameraless exposures. She used the same process to transfer images of odd objects lying around her apartment, like bits of star-shaped confetti and Laitala's own hair rescued from the bathtub drain. The film shifts between images of the magic lantern slides, crudely animated by Laitala's DIY printing process, and the jittery abstract shadows produced by her collection of personal detritus. I should also add that the film is accompanied by a mashup of Tin Pan Alley music that Laitala produced in collaboration with Robert Fox. The specific choices of lantern slides point to the historical theme of audience decorum, a concern that moral reformers and the film industry shared. The creation and maintenance of behavioral standards for audiences was as much a part of the standardization of film exhibition as the setting of technological specifications for projection. This process helped exhibitors draw women and children, among other things, which was the first step to legitimizing cinema in the eyes of the middle class. Laitala's slides, then, look in both historical directions, back to a more indecorous movie-going past, and forward from that moment to the coming changes to exhibition which were intended to exert control over audiences and films. To a filmmaker like Laitala, long active in San Francisco's vibrant alternative cinema scene, the idea of a lost utopia of makeshift screening spaces, populated by marginalized audiences actively participating in the spectacle, is surely appealing, a distant relative of the microcinema. Probably my favorite of Carrie's works, the Retrospectroscope, could be described as an exploded view of turn-of-the-century forces that were at work in cinema's invention. Laitala herself calls it a paracinematic device that, quote, traces an evolutionary trajectory, encircling the viewer in a procession of flickering fantasies of fragmented lyricism. Though she's referring mostly to the work's imagery in the form of still photographs, Laitala could just as easily be describing the entire technological and visual form of the work. The retrospectroscope consists of a vertically mounted plexiglass disc lined with concentric rings of transparent photographs. Each ring depicts a simple event in serial form, like a film strip. A woman enfolded in sheer white fabric slowly turns, a pointed finger wags back and forth, the moon passes through its phases, a trio of nymphs frolic in a 1920s stag film, and the innermost ring depicts a fragment of the Hindenburg disaster. A motor linked to the disc by a drive shaft rapidly rotates the disc, while a strobe light produces the intermittency required to crudely animate the images. Now, though Laitala and others have likened the retrospectroscope to a phenakistoscope or a zoetrope, both of which employed spinning serial images, its inspiration was, in fact, Ottmar Anschutz's much more obscure electrotachyoscope, invented in 1887. That device was almost identical to the retrospectroscope, creating a rudimentary illusion of movement with photographs on a rotating, vertically mounted glass disc. The electrotachyoscope was viewed by spectators peering through an opening in the intervening panel. A Geissler tube illuminated each image as it passed by this opening, and a series of pins on the rotating wheel opened and closed the tube's electrical circuit, generating a rapid flicker in synchronization with the passage of the images over the aperture. Laitala's use of the more modern strobe light instead of Anschutz's Geissler tube to illuminate the disc counterintuitively inverts the technological progress that her choice implies. Since the retrospectroscope is viewed all at once in its entirety rather than one frame at a time, its intermittency is muted, its images blurry relative to those of its Victorian-era grandparent. The implication of this different mode of spectatorial address are clear. The electrotachyoscope is part of a history of making moving images easier to consume, to see. The retrospectroscope is part of a cinematic tradition that has troubled that easy consumption. To close, and to segue into Carrie's presentation, I want to say just a few words about something that I began thinking of when I was finishing the book and that I'm interested in exploring further, which is the relationship between expanded cinema and the studio practices of experimental filmmakers. Now, I'm embarrassed to admit that previously I never thought of filmmaking as a kind of studio art form like painting or sculpture. But the more filmmakers I've talked to over the years, the more I have found this to be the case, and I think it has special implications for expanded cinema. Now, obviously all work needs some kind of physical space, but I had thought of this in merely practical terms, simply the need for a workspace, which might also serve as a storage space for all the filmmaker's stuff. But the studio, I've found, is also an arena for working things out, to put it very informally. Films are made in a space that is quite different from the space in which they're intended to be seen. The filmmaker works with tangible materials that are hidden or forgotten about in normal exhibition. And perhaps this space and these materials suggest different possibilities for cinema, like the installation format, or the use of a projector as creative instrument. It might even suggest the display of cinematic objects, which not only have an intrinsic aesthetic interest, a kind of beauty, but which are also structural homologues for cinematic traits like flicker and intermittency. Perhaps the filmmaker asks, why make all this vanish? Why not preserve the experiences of working with film in a particular kind of space? We'll see all kinds of intriguing ephemera in Carrie's video of her studio. These become part of the studio process, and thus, I think, the work. The studio then is the first rough staging, so to speak, of the mise-en-scène of a future work of expanded cinema. Works of expanded cinema restage the work that goes on in that space, and the imagery, experiences, and feelings that such spaces entail, and which conventional film exhibition cannot preserve. That's the end of my talk. I hope it was interesting. Thanks for watching, and now I'm very happy to turn things over to Carrie.
This is what you see when you approach the door to my studio. It's located in the Redstone building in the Mission, a former union hall, now home to many other artists and nonprofit organizations. It's my fourth studio space after being evicted twice in 12 months because of San Francisco leadership's shifting land use priorities. In 2015, I was booted out with 43 other artists from a studio now home to a biotech company, and in 2016 from a studio now the site of a luxury hotel. I've decorated the walls with examples of my photography and art, as well as some equipment and various secondhand finds. I created these black and white images by electrifying small conductive objects placed on large format film, exposing them through their corona discharge, making cameraless photographs. Here's my favorite silent film star, Buster Keaton, and a bunch of letterpress blocks. I used some of these to make electrophotographs like the ones on the wall. I create several different types of art here: film, expanded cinema, installation, and photography. The 3 photographs at the top of the frame here are all attempts at capturing fleeting moments, representing the projector performances that I miss being able to execute in cinema spaces for captive audiences. Here's where I edit film by cutting and splicing it by hand. Now I'm opening the door to the studio's film collection room. I often work with appropriated film imagery and have scavenged these images from flea markets and sometimes even trash containers. In 2004, a University of California, Berkeley department threw out their entire 16mm film collection, and I was able to make a pilgrimage to their dumpster with a fellow film fiend and get many reels of films. It seems like independent artists are oftentimes working with the detritus of civilization, reappropriating what people no longer have use for. These are signs I commissioned for my kinetic sculpture installations, the Cosmoscope and the Retrospectroscope. They were painted by the local company known as New Bohemia Signs. 25 years ago, I made this kinetic sculpture called the Retrospectroscope, funded in part by the San Francisco Art Institute, which at the time was celebrating its 125th year of existence. It's a late 20th century version of a 19th century paracinematic device, and its creation merged 3 of my passions: photography, cinema, and invention. It's far too large to display in my studio, unfortunately. I'd love to find a home for it where it could be permanently appreciated, so if anyone knows about museums or other institutions looking for work like this, please contact me. I also need to find a home for the Retrospectroscope's 21st century full-color sibling, the Cosmoscope, which I made 5 years ago with funding from the Princess Grace Foundation. Both were displayed at SOMARTS in an exhibit called Timeless Motion, with installation work by other moving image artists Scott Stark, Mark Wilson, Kathleen Quillian, Keith Evans, Jeannie Leota, and Paul Clipson. In some of my performances, I run 16mm film loops and custom-built reels of film through projectors while manipulating the image live, with filters and other objects. Here are some shorter loops that are between 3 and 10 feet long. For longer loops, my dad invented a film looper that can accommodate up to 300 feet of film and runs endlessly. This is positioned on top of the projector and enables one to transform the material and use repetition that becomes part of the rhythm and structure of the imagery creating various permutations. I use specialized optics, masks, and filters to refract, diffuse, reflect, to transform, distort, and expand the rectangular film frame sometimes beyond the screen and onto the audience. Color wheels and external shutters create different kinds of flickering effects. Here is another staging of an expanded cinema performance that I premiered online in 2020 at San Francisco Cinematheque's Crossroads Festival. It uses two 16mm projectors, one image projected on top of the second. It is my response to the fires that have become an annual disaster in California.
Hello. Hey, everybody. Hello out there in YouTube land. Can you hear us?
Yes.
You can hear me, Carrie?
The chat box says yes.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get rolling. So first, I'd like to welcome Jonathan and Carrie to the digital space. Thanks so much for joining us here tonight. And thanks for the wonderful presentations. So I'm going to start things off with a couple of broad questions. I also encourage our audience to drop their questions in the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on that. So maybe to get started, something that I was thinking about actually while reading your book, Jonathan, and preparing for tonight's program was just how different and how distant expanded cinema feels right now, particularly the performance strain, which relies so much on an embodied, multi-sensory experience and dynamic spatial relations, which often takes place in a very intimate, usually indoor setting. And I'm curious about how you feel your book lands in this current moment. It strikes me that the media environment and the social and political context that we find ourselves in now is different in all kinds of ways than the context in which the book was originally conceived and written in. Which also leads me to wonder, like, what is expanded cinema in the pandemic? What has expanded cinema become? Where is expanded cinema? I guess Shapeshifters is one place that it exists, but I'm curious if you've noticed any identifiable new forms or permutations of expanded cinema that have emerged during the pandemic, especially given that one of the primary goals of your book is to define expanded cinema and taxonomize it in a very precise and rigorous way. This feels like a bit of a strange time to be talking about expanded cinema on the one hand, but then on the other hand, it seems like an exciting and possibly transitional moment for the practice. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about all of that. And then for Carrie, I'm curious about how the pandemic has affected the way that you approach your work, if it has at all. Have you had to adapt your studio practice or your ways of working because of COVID? Have new ideas or new thinking, new opportunities or inspirations arisen from these particular conditions that we find ourselves in now? So Jonathan, maybe you could get started.
Yeah, sure. So, a couple of minutes ago, someone posted on the YouTube chat that they really miss seeing these shows, the Shapeshifter shows live. And, I think that although I'm really glad that we can do this, and in certain ways, it makes some things easier, but there really is an aspect of it that it's sort of a direct, embodied, social aspect of expanded cinema that's missing, and I think it's not limited to expanded cinema. It may just be that expanded cinema sort of embodies it the most directly or the most forcefully. And but one of the points of my book is to try to bring expanded cinema out from the kind of outer reaches and the periphery of film culture, including experimental film culture, and to really show how I think it is that the qualities that we think of when we think of expanded cinema, interaction, participation, liveness, embodiedness, and attentiveness to space and the context in which films are seen, that these things I think are part and parcel of experimental or avant-garde film culture, or whatever we'd like to call it. And so social distancing and COVID in general is making those aspects of expanded cinema and of experimental film difficult to sustain, difficult to achieve. And although, there's a lot to be said for social media and the internet, and these are often looked at as somehow kind of related to the history um, of expanded cinema. It's just it's not doing these, and maybe I shouldn't say it since I'm sitting here doing it, but doing these virtually just shows the kind of two-dimensionality of this kind of mediated interaction, so I think people miss. People who are missing live events, in-person events at places like Shapeshifters, I think are missing that kind of direct participation in a cinematic and a social culture that's really exciting and really gratifying. And I felt that way very much as well. And I felt it the most when I've participated in expanded cinema works. So when I've seen Carrie perform live, when I've screened Line Describing a Cone or Light Music by Liz Rhodes, and this kinds of works where everybody kind of gets involved. So that's missing. And so it was odd for the book to come out in the midst of a time when we couldn't do a lot of the things that are basic to, I think, the nature of experimental cinema and of expanded cinema. As far as new strains, it's funny. It's sort of like, are there new emerging and perhaps more contagious strains of expanded cinema emerging during the pandemic? I think it's, it's too early for me to see, but I'm sure that just as we're going to probably have Hollywood horror movies about COVID in the next year or two, that we're going to have experimental film and media work that meditates on this experience. I can sort of only predict that, but I also, I wouldn't be surprised to see when we finally reach the light at the end of the tunnel and this is over. I think we're going to want to go back to doing this again. We're going to have missed it so much. And I really hope that's the case. So it may be that we see a kind of spike in this activity just because I think it will feel really good to do.
So, yeah, the pandemic has been tricky. The nice thing about working in the way that I work is a lot of times I can just go to my studio and, try things out. I can expose film in my studio, and I can also I've been going through a lot of material that I've shot for years and years and years that I never did anything with. So, I feel like this time has been, for me, a time of reflection and trying to find this other place for all of this other footage that I've shot, and think about ways that when we can all get together again, there'll be new work to show. So, yeah, I think because I work pretty in a pretty solitary way a lot of the time, it's not the worst thing in the world, but trying to get to my studio is a bit tricky. So yeah, it's safest to walk because public transportation and even taking a cab is a little tricky because sometimes people don't wear their masks. So but anyway, yeah, I'm just trying to stay focused on just creating work and looking at old material and finding, sometimes when I shoot material and I produce something, I haven't actually found a spot for it to exist in a certain way. And then it's almost like it needs to sit in a box for a long time, and then it becomes like found footage. So yeah, so I've been uncovering a lot of stuff and trying to stay optimistic about everything, but
So a comment from Jeffrey Scholar, who says, couldn't you also say that we are doing it right at this moment? What we're doing right now at this moment is a form of expanded cinema. Seeing Carrie's work in this context is like a portal on the shut-in day. That reminds me of something that came up when we were planning for this this online presentation. That Jonathan, I think you said it sounds like we're going to be existing in a Stan Vanderbeek art piece or something like that. And I guess that is somewhat related to what Jeffrey's referring to.
Yeah, I mean, this is a medium, and I was going to say a medium like any other. I don't not necessarily know if that's true, but I mean, right. I think that this is a medium in which interesting work could be done. And there is a kind of, I don't want to necessarily downplay the genuine social interaction that can be that can be experienced in this mode. I'll just say that, for example, my parents, who are approaching their 80s and who both have health conditions that make them, in addition to their age, much more susceptible to COVID than say I am. And, they are shut in at this point, and they're really, it's gone from being, I think, an irritation and a frustration to something that's really demoralizing and potentially hazardous to their mental health. And it's through Zoom and social media and so forth, and even just email chains, that they've been able to continue to interact, although in this limited way. So, I mean, that could be something that could be explored. I mean, I always think of cinema and expanded cinema and experimental cinema as kind of the original social media, because there really was this way in which audiences and filmmakers and critics and film programmers and so forth really did and really do interact in that culture in ways that they don't in other cinematic traditions. But yes, I mean, I think that I'm certain that something very interesting and telling could be done in this format. And you're right, Brett, that it would go back to a kind of vision that Stan Vanderbeek had, that this medium, which, is so much under the control of corporations and has been so commodified and so monetized, that it could actually be used for much more progressive social and political ends. And in a small way, that's probably what we're doing now. So yeah, I mean, in a way, this is funny. I mean, in a way, in the book, I talk about Stan Vanderbeek, but I know that subsequent generations of expanded cinema practitioners, I think, wanted to distance themselves from the kind of techno-utopian rhetoric that's often associated with him and Marshall McLuhan and so forth. Maybe this is his revenge on us.
On you specifically.
Yeah, definitely on me. Right.
Because in a way, comparing the Zoom interface and this mode of interaction to expanded cinema runs counter to the argument that you're making in the book, which is it's an argument for specificity. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about your methodology. And I'm thinking in particular about the importance of specificity, medium specificity theory to the arguments that you're making in the book. And it feels very much like an art historical kind of approach that's very rooted in formal analysis. But could you expand a little bit more on that aspect?
Yeah, I would say that I'm a believer in specificity. I think it's it focuses attention, it focuses effort, and I think that communities, although there's I've talked about, say, experimental film culture or the experimental film community, and I don't mean to kind of make that a monolith. There's a great deal of diversity of all kinds there, but I think that some sense of a shared tradition, some sense of a shared field of work, of people, of references, of ideas, is also something that's it's not a constriction or a confining limitation. I think it's actually something that provides people something that they can self-identify with, and therefore interact with others around that specific thing in a kind of like a common language. And so, I'm interested in specificity for that reason. And so when I talk about specificity in the book, I talk about it sort of in three, dimensions. There's the specificity of media. So, I mean, specifically physical media, film, digital video, analog video, this kind of broadcast. I mean, they all have sort of physical, technological qualities that distinguish them from one another and that make certain things possible in one that aren't in another. And then the other sort of levels of specificity I talk about they're sort of increasingly general specificities. So it may be a bit oxymoronic, but there's the specificity of cinema just as an art form. And, in relationship to, say, painting or performance or literature or music. And then there is sort of in between those two things, the specificity of a cinematic culture. I call it a mode of film practice in the book. That's kind of academese, but I really just think calling this a film or a moving image or a media culture that has its own history, its own institutions, its own discourses, certainly with overlap between others, whether in the art world or whether in more mainstream film culture, but that it's at least semi-specific and recognizable as a kind of institution with a small I, not a capital I. And so I actually, I'm interested in those things because I think that they contribute to a kind of sense of belonging that's valuable and that provide a sort of a shared kind of language. And so that's why specificity is kind of an important aspect of my book. But I would hate to think that it's really just reducible to a kind of formalist medium specificity like Greenberg or whoever. And that it's actually something that's a lot more flexible that can both accommodate specificity but also overlap between art forms, between media, and between different, say, traditions or cultures.
It looks like we have some questions stacking up here in the chat, so I'm just going to start bringing some of these into the mix. From Neil Johnson, he's asking, given the dichotomy between experimental film and commercial cinema, is the performance aspect of expanded cinema the decommodification of the art form? Carrie, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I know you've written about this this question before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not something that's very easily packaged, and it's definitely not something that one does for the money, because that's kind of not possible to, you're not going to make enough money to live off of. So I think that it's just something that you, as an artist, I mean, I feel like I'm compelled to work with this particular medium in the way that I do, and I don't even really think about the money. So I don't know. I feel like I can justify almost anything that any money that I spend on it. So yeah, I mean, it's outside of the realm of that kind of structure. But that doesn't mean that, at least I have the freedom to do whatever I want to do. And I don't necessarily feel like I would ever have to modify the art that I make to satisfy some type of, demand from like a producer or from a company that wants a certain kind of product. So that's good.
It does seem as though expanded cinema is perhaps uniquely anti-capitalist as a form. Question here from Los Angeles Film Forum. For both of you, what entails this quote-unquote successful expanded cinema event? Consciousness raising, what does that mean? Anything else?
Well, a successful event is one where the projector doesn't break and the bulb doesn't blow halfway through the performance and the belt doesn't break. And, I try and just get into this meditative space when I'm working with the medium, and I don't really, I try not to have very lofty expectations about what I do. I just do it. So
And Jonathan, for you, as obviously a fan of expanded cinema and as an audience participant, what for you constitutes a successful piece? Like, what are the attributes of a piece that would compel you to want to perhaps write about it?
Yeah. As soon as you asked that question, I thought joy. Like I think that, that look, my book is an academic book, which is not necessarily joyful for people. It does engage in analysis and history, but the um, most of the works that I talk about have brought me a kind of joy, even ones that are pitched, I think, at a fairly intellectual level. I mean, I think there are some works that, are really intense. Reflections and meditations on all kinds of philosophical questions, and certainly one could expend a lot of gray matter on these things. But what made me want to write about it in the first place, and what's made me continue to write it over the past almost 20 years, has been just the pleasure I get from the works. I mean, it's a real kind of joy, whether it's a joy taken in the kind of beauty of the work. I mean, Carrie just talked about her work in a very pragmatic way. That I just hope all the things work. I just hope all the machines don't break down, and that's true. And I actually, and I've had that happen when we've had visiting artists. We've had things break, but I've gotten not only a great joy from seeing and participating in expanded cinema performances, events, or just seeing works, installations, and objects, and so forth, but seeing other people in the moment, whether they're my students, fellow audience members, whoever, also share that joy. That has been really, for me, what's sustained all of this work. As fascinating as the theoretical questions are, and as interesting as it was to really plumb the depths of the history, the whole project, and all the work that's done to make, just like a projection performance happen, is sustained by just great pleasure, aesthetic pleasure, and also I just think a kind of social pleasure of having a kind of often sublime experience with other people and seeing them have that too.
A question here from Scott Stark that I think it would be interesting to get both of your perspectives on. How are you seeing expanded cinema fitting into an online exhibition schema?
Carrie, you go first.
Well, it's kind of online schema. I mean, we're kind of doing that right now. I think it's interesting to think about trying to explore different opportunities. And I know actually Scott has an interesting project that he's working on right now, which is a radio show on Saturday night. And he's kind of he and Kathleen Tyner are moving through their record collection and kind of doing these interesting layerings of different 45 records, and really playing with, this kind of creating these soundscapes. But I really loved Scott's Shapeshifters show, which happened a couple months ago with this ice, and you're seeing the ice that is in the process of melting and faces morphing, and he's manipulating the ice. And it had a very immediate kind of impression that it made on me was having to do with the way in which we kind of are all in this state of there's like a flux happening, but then we're also kind of stuck in the situation. And so I think that was Shapeshifters is continuing to do their work. And I've also been able to participate in a couple of really great workshops. One was a cyanotype workshop that was put on through Engage. So I don't know. I think there is like a certain way that the educational aspect, maybe you could play around with this idea that that could be somehow leading to an expanded or creating more of an expanded opportunity for people to be able to make work that they can use. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I would say about, online exhibition is, one of the difficulties of writing about expanded cinema is that it is often by design ephemeral, one-off. If actually Jeannie Leota, who I know is here or in the same virtual space that we are, wrote about doing micro cinema work, and she said, if you miss it, you miss it. If you weren't there, too bad. And so it's hard to write about because one relies on documentation. One of the things I really want to do in the book was have a lot of images, and I do. And it took a very long time to get these images. And for every image that's in the book, there are probably 20 or 30 that I have that just didn't make it in. And it occurred to me that suddenly I have this enormous archive of expanded cinema documentary. I shouldn't say suddenly, because I fortunately from the generosity of so many filmmakers, including Carrie, I have lots of documentation of work, and I know that there are other people who do as well. I mean, I'm thinking of people like Mark Webber, and I'm thinking of archives like the study collection in the UK, and I mean, I hope I don't regret saying this. It would be wonderful if or maybe wonderful is putting it too strongly. You can tell I'm slightly nervous about this. Maybe it would be, it would be wonderful. It would be a good idea if we could maybe have some kind of repository for this work, and it's not going to be a museum. It's not going to be where you can go and look at the physical work. So I sort of have been toying with this idea of tentatively thinking about putting together some kind of online archive of high quality images. The artists themselves would obviously be deeply involved in this, and it would be a way of preserving the work and also circulating it, because otherwise it cannot circulate. Now, admittedly, that's gonna mute the work in certain, if you're not at a performance or if you're not there to see the kind of tangible qualities of the object, you miss something. But I'm, especially as someone who teaches this work to students who are isolated from it, I'd rather they see something than nothing. And if the something could be something that that the artists themselves have chosen and have a kind of investment in, and so the quality is it's going to be as good as possible, then maybe that's a possibility.
So speaking of Jeannie Leota, there's a comment from her in the chat here, which I will relay. There are definitely some cool Zoom performances happening, not just as a display medium, but a creative medium. Chris Cato says, we can still do expanded cinema anywhere outside, we just can't draw audiences. Steve Polta, just to say, networked AV performances are definitely happening. Stream spanded cinema is proposed as a new term to add to your list. Do a stream in 360 and you can a more expanded feel, like an early Eames Disney spectacular. I think that catches us up to the comments in the chat. There's also a question here from Artadio Vids. I'd like to hear Jonathan expand on the idea of participation. Is it bound to the body?
I'm looking for that question in the chat, so that here we go. Is it bound to the body? I mean, that is a good question. I think I've been talking about it as though it is, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. I think there are, there must be other ways um, that that one can participate. I think probably my emphasis, and maybe this hasn't been fully conscious on my part, but I think my emphasis has been on the bodily, on being there. Um, and partly, I suppose, it's meant as a kind of corrective to the ephemerality and the sort of disconnectedness of social media. That although we live in very much in a very mediated world, even before COVID, and will continue to do so after COVID, we're still physical beings, and I still think that we have a relationship with space and with tangible physical objects that is important for our emotional lives, and so I have tended to, I think, gravitate toward a kind of sense of bodily participation, even if that just means a sort of a soft interaction, that you're there, and that, say, the filmmaker who's also running the projector is like right behind you and right there, and then you're going to be able to talk to them afterwards. So it's not entirely bodily. It's not just about, say, physical sensation or presence. It is about being able to interact with other people in a way that other modes of cinema either don't allow or don't emphasize or discourage in various ways, including all those rules about audience decorum that are featured in those Magic Lantern slides that turn up in Carrie's work, the Muse of Cinema series. But no, I mean, I suppose that, there are ways that participation can be sort of, discursive, that there can be that kind of discussion and interaction, where the work is partly what people are inputting into it. I mean, sort of what's happening right now. That I think that kind of participatory activity, could potentially be really interesting.
There's Kathleen Quillian, by the way, dropped a note to say that there's 8 years of documentation of Shapeshifters shows on Facebook, for better or worse. Definitely for better. Larks and Swallows has a question for you, Carrie. When you create your work, do you have an idea of a communal audience in mind?
Well, I don't know. I feel like when I'm creating work, I'm usually creating it in a strange kind of vacuum. So, yeah, communal audience. I'm just trying to kind of wrap my head around that.
I guess, to what extent are you thinking of audience as you're making your work?
Well, I mean, I definitely, I guess it depends on the project. Some projects are kind of more, geared towards an interest that doesn't really have a lot to do with necessarily the outside world, but I did a whole series of works that was revolving around the Panama Pacific International Exposition from 1915. And so that body of work kind of all came out in 2015. And I knew that there was going to be a lot of interest in that because it was the 100th anniversary. And so it was kind of an interesting thing to be part of all of these other events and all these other groups of people, from collectors to historians and to lots of people who were really interested in San Francisco history. So that was definitely a kind of, I would say, an audience of very many people, many of whom I'd never met and wouldn't even see at most micro cinemas. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And I thought it was interesting with George Mashunas, the expanded arts diagram, because I saw that there was a mention of the World's Fairs in that in pretty close proximity to expanded cinema. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to consider. Because the Panama Pacific International Exposition may have been the first time that there was a light show on the West Coast, certainly in the Bay Area. Yeah, so there were 42 Marines that would be controlling these giant searchlights, and they were located on the breakwater, and they would project this light through steam, and they would project, they would use colored filters, and they would be projecting in all the architecture. And they were moving these lights through a choreographed drill. And that whole drill was all designed by this lighting engineer named Walter Darcy Ryan. So that whole kind of doing that kind of research and thinking about that was something that to me was really exciting. And so somehow all of that came together. And there you have it. That was kind of, I would say, a long-winded answer for a communal audience. But anyway.
So Jeannie says yes to the body. I think that might be in reference to a previous question. Lynn Sachs notes that Bradley Arrows has been doing some marvelous expanded projector screenings on Zoom with many people showing 16 millimeter films from at the same time from all over the world.
Cool.
I think a quick time check here, it's 8:25. So I think we're kind of getting close to being at the end of our time. If there are any other questions that our audience has, this would be the time to ask them. I also wanted to give Jonathan and Carrie the opportunity to ask each other questions if you wanted to, or if there was any kind of conversation topics that you kind of had that you wanted to sort of bring into the mix as well.
We were going to talk about, when we were planning this, Carrie and I talked about talking about, you know, the issue of the studio. Which I don't, you know, we did in our respective presentations at the beginning, but we really haven't talked about it very much. And you know, if Carrie, if you want to, we can. It's up to you. I think so. I liked, you know, I'm gonna ask you, did you gussy up your studio at all for that presentation, or is that kind of the way? I kind of think that's kind of the way it is a lot of the time.
A lot of the lights are doing their thing, but it was kind of, I had to do a lot of cleaning because I am a bit of a hoarder. So anyway, I was pretty careful with how I shot the film collection, because that room is the room that always has lots and lots and lots of stuff. But anyway, yeah, the studio. I'm very lucky that I have one, and you know, hoping that I'll be able to hang on to it. And yeah, I don't know. It's a crazy thing to. I don't know how I would be able to do what I do in my apartment because it's just way too small. So having a studio is a pretty necessary thing. And just also having a place to go to. It's kind of strange to live in a tiny apartment and at least there's like another change of scenery that I can have going there, because it feels, you know, it can get pretty claustrophobic around here. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think like when I saw, you know, the video footage of your studio, I think that if you had just shown it to me out of context without your name on it and with some of the like identifying markers like the retrospectroscope, if those had been, say, blurred out or something, I still think I would have recognized, I would have guessed it was your workspace. You know, and that's been sort of fruitful for me to think about it. I mean, and I've seen the studios and the workspaces, whatever you want to call them, of other experimental filmmakers and people who make expanded cinema, and you know, I really do see a kind of, you know, the studio is kind of the work, the first work, in a way, or it's a kind of work, and maybe whether it's intended to be or not. And I see something of your personality definitely in your studio, and I see links between your work and the lighting and the structure and the kind of ephemera that's in the studio, and some of the artists whose work I included here. It's the same thing, and that's what kind of got me thinking about it. But like I said, I'm sort of embarrassed by this as a blind spot, but really not thinking of experimental filmmakers as studio practitioners, other than just the simple fact that you have to store stuff somewhere. But so thinking about that and looking at the presentation you made has been very helpful. So,
Jonathan, just to follow up on what you were saying, is it fruitful for you to understand the way that the work develops in the studio, because it helps you understand the projects from a technical perspective better? Because I know that a lot of works that you write about in the book are very complex in terms of the technical components and apparatus. Is that part of it for you?
That's definitely part of it for me. That whatever I can do to really get, and part of it is I've been bitten before. I've made big mistakes and big mistakes in ways I've described works in the past and in other writings. Luckily, some of them are kind of obscure, and hopefully no one will ever find them. But I've had to just kind of do my best to figure out what was being done, and so it was definitely a mission for me. To get as much, and sometimes this sounds sort of like dull work, but I actually don't think it is. Like understanding how things work just on a physical or a technical level, I think has actually been very, very useful, and it provides a way into then analyzing the work more formally. But I also, but partly like seeing this filmmaker's studio, I think also just gives me a sense not just of the technical aspect of the work, but also how the person works. One of the things I've hoped I've done in the book is to try. I'm not an artist, but I've tried to kind of channel in a certain way the way of talking and thinking about work that's much more from an artist's perspective than from an academic's perspective. That there's a language of this work and a language of process that's not the language of academic art history, cinema studies, what have you. It's the varied languages of artists that I really actually find very interesting, and that shouldn't be a kind of alien discourse to academics at all, although unfortunately in a lot of ways it is. And so just it's like sort of like being in the space with them and talking with them about it and seeing them work. That's a part of it as well.
I guess sort of to wrap things up, and on that note, Carrie, what's going on in your studio these days? What's on the workbench? What are you developing? What's next for you?
I'm working on some photographs now, and kind of I've been doing a lot of kind of motion analysis, or my idea of motion analysis. Using some industrial strobes, and I've been working with freezing water and seeing how I can create, some type of perspective through the water that is capturing some other ancillary detail. It's kind of hard to explain, but yeah, so getting back into the photography, but also just exploring time with the still image. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Carrie and Jonathan. Thanks to our wonderful audience for tuning in and for all of your questions and comments. And finally, big thank you to Shapeshifters for hosting this program.
Thanks, Brett. I'm really happy that you invited me to be a part of this, and it's been a lot of fun. Okay.
Thanks to Brett and to Shapeshifters,
Yeah.
and to everyone who was here, wherever here is.
And don't forget, if you haven't already, to pick up a copy of Jonathan's book, 520 pages on expanded cinema.
A lot of pictures.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thanks
All right.
for tuning in.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.